All right, so our data society book, data visualization and society book, everyone is going to read the first chapter just so we have this shared understanding, and also just provides a good basic introduction to data and data types. So datafication was the term that they introduced that encapsulates the idea about the modern trends where more and more data is being gathered. This is usually in the big data world, being gathered, analyzed, stored, and made publicly accessible than ever before. I'm not sure how generalized knowledge it is about the public accessibility, but not only are companies like Amazon like storing everything about you ever, but it's really easy to access a lot of that kind of data, as well as things like scientific studies. There's a big movement in the psychology world, I think the scientific world more in general, where they're pushing for data to be publicly accessible so that other scientists can try to replicate findings. So there's a lot of areas where this is true. And I think one of the impacts of COVID has actually been where people have seen these kind of transformations, where we have all of this information about like the hospitalization rates and testing rates and all this kind of stuff, gathered by all these hospitals in different places and brought together, and you have different people doing analyses on these, and we get like these dashboards all the time from different places looking at different trends and all this kind of stuff, and that would not have been possible in the same way 10 years ago even. So yeah, datafication. They go into why DataViz is an important tool. Biggest part of helping the public understand, but also it's really interesting, well, at least I find it interesting how they talked about how it's difficult to tell the impact on society or on people's individual lives, because the transformation and the amount of sharing that's out there is new. And you can kind of, again, sorry to bring up COVID, thought you were trying to get away from this stuff, but you can see that a lot with how people have reacted to seeing the data or seeing variations of it. People making their own decisions instead of relying on experts or selectively ignoring certain data. But also just the power of simple visualizations to help people understand, like how many people understood what not values were before 2020? Most people don't, right? That's like very much a scientific world type of language. And now like just a lot of random people who would never have thought about that kind of stuff before, like actually really know about that, and like thinking about like how those graphs show the rates and how to read those kind of charts and stuff like that. So yeah, it's important to think about the good and bad, how it impacts, and how we're not always sure what any individual data visualization will do to society or in individuals' lives, or how the trend of datafication will impact the world. They went to data basics. So DataViz data, anything that can be subjected to categorization, abstraction, and translation into graphical representation. So you might have stored it before with databases, you might have analyzed quantitative data in the data mining class, but this is kind of a nice wide definition in how they're thinking about data. They talked briefly about the differences between qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative data is generally text-based data. The qualitative methods for data are very different from quantitative data. quantitative data being our numerical data that we love to run stats on. In the notes, I dropped a link about the difference between qual and quantitative data in case you're not that familiar with those terms. And if you're interested in seeing the differences in methodology, this is a little bit more of the anthropological, psychological, sociology type folks get into qualitative data from a data collection standpoint. It's not necessary for this class, but if you're interested. They talked briefly about structured versus unstructured data. Unstructured data is basically the unprocessed data. So that could be raw numerical data, or it could be any other sort of data that hasn't been processed yet. So if you're doing text analytics and you're analyzing novels, when you just download the words, that's definitely super duper duper unstructured, right? They talked a little bit about big data. This class isn't focused on big data, although the data visualizations will, for your project, will probably work best with big data, just so that you can get a lot of different visualizations from it. The 3 V's are generally the volume, variety, and velocity. So the amount of data coming in, variety just is not just like one column. Velocity is the speed that's coming in. Variability and value they're coming up with more stuff to describe it. What is big data in terms of what is going to be like from are you data mining big data, or are you doing analytics on smaller data? Those boundaries are super duper sketchy. I'm trying to remember what Liberty said in terms of when I took the data mining class. I can't remember if it was 3,000, 5,000, or 10,000 rows, but it's a lot of data. That's going to be, if you're working for companies and you're doing things for like Amazon, you're playing in the big data world. If you're working for a small mid-sized company, you're probably not, unless you're like ultra successful. Yeah, like I haven't had a job yet that dealt with big data because I've been working for a mid-sized company with like 1,000 employees. Like that's not enough to be called big data, really. And then they talked about the differences between data visualization, information viz, information graphics, and scientific viz. They didn't really define information viz. So basically data viz is a data picture, like it's a picture built from data. It's based on data. It's typically descriptive statistics. So anything that we do in this class is probably going to be descriptive statistics. I don't expect you to be running like regressions and then doing anything from those, for example. That'd be more of the data mining class, right? Information visualization, visual representation of abstract data, according to Wikipedia. And generally the internet said that this is basically data viz within the business context. So it's basically like a data viz with business rules. And so instead of just presenting data, it is more targeted and aimed at getting a specific decision or influencing a decision to go a certain way. They're very, very, very close though. Infographics, so it is not technically data viz because it may or may not even contain data in the first place. And it's really focused on mass communication. If you've never heard the term before, you've probably seen infographics. They're really just popular ways of just showing a lot of data. Yeah, they can be like very graphical and eye-pleasing. And they don't necessarily have like charts and stuff that's based off of actual data. It might have like a drawn representation of a chart or something though. I included it in the last week of this class because you're going to be working on your projects, and so it's a little bit, last week tends to be kind of a buffer week, but I think they're really important tools for getting information out there, and you can include real data viz inside of them. So I included that as a little bit of a fluff but good information week. The last one here is scientific viz. So that's the expert data pictures, basically. So that's generally like the computer animations of phenomena, topographical scans, etc. The like really fancy stuff, which is beyond the scope of this class. Yeah, so terminology is always good to have. Okay, and then the data viz meaning making. They talked about the semiotic side of things. Those of you who aren't knowledgeable about this area, including me, I'm like, I don't know what this term is. I went and Googled things too, which I do suggest that, because they don't really go into it that much. But basically between these three, the ideational meeting, basically the topic of discourse, the interpersonal meeting is how the participants are relating with material, and the compositional meeting is what semiotic resources are activated. Basically what I got out of that was that that you need to think about the audience. What do they think is true? What information have they been exposed to? And what is their data literacy? Again, thinking about the pandemic, most people who are digesting the information about not rates and all that kind of stuff are not professionals, right? They're lay people. So that their data literacy, you're gonna guess that they are lower in data literacy. Just like how when you write for like a newspaper, you assume people have like a 6th grade or 7th grade education. You always assume low so that you can make it applicable for everybody or digestible for everybody. What do they think is true? Like, you know, there's been a lot of misinformation or scattered information, and so you need to consider what have they been exposed to if it's been misinformation, what biases might they have, you know, all these little aspects. And that's especially important if it's anything to do with politics these days, obviously, right? Also aesthetics. So pretty pictures got attention. There's meanings that are associated with colors. For example, back in the day, pink used to be the masculine color, and now it's the color for girls, right? So when we have anything to do with gender, we often like color code things pink as girls, but that only makes sense in today's world, not if you took that data viz back, you know, a few decades to back when before that switched over, right? So you have to be thinking about those things in addition to things like making sure that's okay for colorblind folks, knowing things like the company that I've been working for. A lot of times we use red and green for like bad and good, but just like how a lot of students are sensitive to like the red pen when you correct their papers in America, not true in other places of the world necessarily. But just how people are sensitive to that, the employees were sensitive to like red being bad, so they wanted color coding that was like nicer and made them like didn't make them feel bad about things being like not going well in the organization. So if they saw a graph that was doing the red-green thing and they saw a lot of red, we were evoking emotions that were not helpful in that situation. It was creating anxiety and stress where we needed them to be focusing on what they needed to do in order to, you know, like boost their strengths or minimize their weaknesses or whatever they were going to do. Yeah, And then I thought this was a really good quote, that data visualizations may seem to reflect reality in a more direct way than words because they're based on numbers which seem trustworthy. But this does not mean that they are more true in the sense that they offer a more objective representation of the world. Yeah, I thought that was really powerful for a couple of reasons. One is that data can lie. It could be, we can have wrong data. Data could be misrepresented. There's a whole lot of things that can go wrong with data, right? And so it can seem to reflect reality when it can be like very, very off. But people often think, oh, data is objective, therefore it's true. So we need to be very cautious about what data we're using, how we're dealing with it in order to build the visualizations. Because most people won't think about the data critically, or we don't give them the information to even make those critical assessments of what could be wrong with the data. Okay, so those were my main takeaways from the book. So I'll be interested to hear if there's anything else really powerful that you took away from that chapter.